Without question, Street Fighter II is the most impactful, innovative, and important fighting game of all time. The game has laid the foundation for every fighting game that followed, and its influence can still be felt today. However, when people usually think about the game they played in the 90s in arcades, the original World Warrior version is very rarely the one that comes to mind first. The far faster and more in-depth Turbo or Super Turbo versions are what people usually point to. After completing the arcade mode and playing some classic verses in this version, it's not hard to see why. Firstly, the original Street Fighter II only has 8 playable characters. Not a bad roster size for 91, especially when you consider the cast is quadruple the size of Street Fighter 1, but so many staples of the Street Fighter II games people immediately think of wouldn't come until later. There's no Cammy, Bison, DJ, Vega, etc. But that's not to say the cast is bad. Each character has a distinct moveset and design, from the classic Shoto archetype of Ryu, to a Russian grappler in Zangief, to an unexplainable green beast that can wield electricity in Blanca. These characters have stood the test of time and remain staples of the franchise for a reason. The music and visuals also have been massively upgraded from the original game as well. Characters to stages to the overall UI, the design and art style of the game is miles ahead of the previous entry in the franchise. Admittedly, the character portraits are still a little off. They look like beta designs that almost don't match with what you would find in later entries. They're not bad, they're just a little off-putting, but it's hardly a big deal when the rest of the game looks great. I can't praise the stages enough. America, Thailand, China, etc. are all classic stages that look great 30 years later, with great use of color and background entities that help each stage pop and feel distinct. I mentioned the music already, but it can't be understated how great it is. Each character's theme has stood the test of time. I could play Ryu, Ken, or Guile's themes to somebody on the street, and I wouldn't be surprised if they immediately recognize it just from casually playing Street Fighter II in the arcades years ago. The OST was handled by the legendary Yoko Shimomura, who would go on to work for the Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts soundtracks later in her career. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There's a reason many likely remember later versions of Street Fighter II more fondly. The game feels slow and would have its game speed doubled by later versions. As mentioned, the playable fighters are small for today's standards, and some characters are dramatically overtuned, such as Guile, who is the best anti-air in the game, the best fireball, and incredible normals. The game also lacks depth. Each character has a max of 3 specials, with most only having 2. This leaves the game in the weird space where it does feel good to play, but not for long stretches of time, as there's so little room to experiment and create your own style. This is exemplified by a poor combo system. Street Fighter II is credited as one of the first fighting games to actually have combos, but this was not intentional. The game had a bug creating frame data that allowed for this to happen, making it difficult to get anything beyond a 2-hit combo, or 3 at most if you knew what you were doing. The arcade mode / story mode is the only thing left to really comment on. Rest assured, it's gotten a massive upgrade over the original, just like everything else in this game. The arcade mode as you take on the other 7 playable characters you didn't select, and the 4 boss characters, Victorious and Bison being the final among them. It's a basic story mode to be sure, but it feels good to play and that's what matters. It does have its weird moments though. There's some major translation errors, the ending windscreens are a mixed bag in terms of the art, to put it lightly, but the big issue is the AI. There's some notable input reading that makes most fights feel unfair. Almost all jump-ins get caught, their grabs are ridiculous, and most charge inputs just don't have to be charged by the computers. The aforementioned story also doesn't have too much going on. Street Fighter II is much more of a game about its individual characters and their motivations rather than the overarching plot, but at least there's something to actually sink your teeth into this time. There's a couple other minor problems to talk about, like the game having no mirror matches and the boss characters not being playable, and some odd timings for inputs, which help drag the score down. However, Street Fighter II has stood the test of time for a reason. Even if future versions of the game are better, art, the music, and the general gameplay were the best available at the time and still hold up 3 decades later. But, as already mentioned, there are better versions to look at for this game, which will be reviewed soon enough. First up though, we have Championship Edition to talk about. As for this version of Street Fighter II though, the original World Warrior version, it's probably a 4.5 out of 10, with it leaning closer to a 5 than a 4.